The call came in the late afternoon, when the light over Los Angeles turns gold and long shadows begin to stretch across the walls like memories trying to stand back up. Dean Martin was alone in his living room, the windows open just enough to let in the breeze. It's just enough to let the outside world remind him that it was still moving, even when he felt as if he was not. An old record spun softly somewhere in the house, a song he had heard so many times, it no longer felt like sound, only atmosphere. He was not drinking. He had not been for hours. He was simply sitting, his hands folded loosely, staring at nothing in particular. When the phone rang, it rang 3 times before he reached it. He did not know why he waited. Perhaps part of him already understood that some calls do not ask permission before changing the weight of a day. When he lifted the receiver, he expected a familiar voice, maybe a producer, maybe a friend. Instead, he heard a woman's voice, calm, careful, trained to speak around heavy news. She introduced herself as a nurse from a private facility outside Newport Beach. She did not rush. She did not dramatize. She simply said John Wayne's name, and the room seemed to narrow around it. She explained that John's condition had worsened, that the doctors believed time had become something delicate, that John had asked quietly but clearly if Dean might come. For a moment, Dean did not answer. He stood there, with the phone pressed to his ear, his other hand resting on the edge of the table, his eyes drifting to a framed photograph across the room. It showed 2 younger men on a dusty set, arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting into the sun as if daring it to outshine them. They looked invincible, like men who believed days were endless things. "I'll come," Dean said finally. After he hung up, he remained standing, the receiver still warm in his hand. He had not seen John in a long time. Not really. They had exchanged messages, the occasional phone call, the polite signals of 2 lives that had once been deeply intertwined but now moved in separate orbits. The world liked to imagine legends as permanent, as though time signed contracts with famous names promising not to touch them. But Dean knew better. He had watched enough friends grow quiet, enough laughter fade into memory, enough rooms empty out. He went upstairs slowly and opened a closet he rarely touched. Inside hung jackets from another era, suits that remembered his shoulders differently, shoes that had walked onto sets and stages where everything had once felt electric. He chose something simple: dark slacks, a clean shirt, a jacket not meant for cameras. This was not a visit for an audience. This was not nostalgia. This was something more fragile. As he dressed, memories came uninvited. John laughing too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. John standing silently beside a river on location, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on water, as if it were telling him secrets. Long nights, loud rooms, early mornings. The way John would slap his back instead of hugging him, as though touch needed to be disguised as impact. The way he would grow suddenly serious when the talk drifted toward family, faith, or fear, then break the tension with a grin before anyone could ask too much. Dean paused at the mirror. The man looking back at him was not the one who had once walked beside John Wayne through studio gates with the certainty that tomorrow would always arrive on schedule. His hair was thinner. His face carried its own map now, but his eyes still recognized themselves. They still held the same question. What do you do with the time that remains? The drive south felt longer than it was. The highway unspooled like a ribbon through the evening light, and Dean drove without music, letting the sound of tires on asphalt fill the car. He passed billboards advertising new faces, new stories, new heroes. He did not resent them. He simply observed them, the way a man watches waves after he has already survived his own storms. He thought about the last time he and John had argued. It had been over something small. It was always something small. A misunderstood comment. A joke that landed wrong. Pride dressed up as humor. They had laughed it off in the end. But something subtle had shifted, as if a door had not closed all the way. After that, life had done what life does. It had filled the space with other obligations, other conversations, other urgencies, until the unsaid things grew old enough to feel permanent. When the facility finally came into view, it did not look like the places people imagine when they think of final days. It was quiet, landscaped, almost peaceful. Palm trees stood like sentinels along the entrance. The building itself seemed designed to soothe rather than intimidate. But Dean felt the weight of it before he even parked inside. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and flowers. Soft lights lined the halls. A receptionist looked up, recognized him instantly, and her expression shifted into something gentler. She did not ask his name. She only nodded and gestured for a nurse. As they walked, Dean's footsteps sounded too loud to him. He kept his hands in his pockets, then took them out, then folded them, as if unsure what position might be appropriate. For a man about to step back into the orbit of someone who had once loomed so large in his life, the nurse spoke in a low voice, explaining where they were going, what to expect. Dean heard her, but he was already somewhere else, standing again on old sets under hot lights. Beside a man who filled frames simply by existing in them, they stopped in front of a door at the end of a quieter corridor. The nurse turned to him. "He's awake," she said. "Not very strong. But he's been waiting." The word stayed with him, waiting, as if John had been holding the line between moments, refusing to step forward until something unfinished had been addressed. Dean nodded once. The nurse opened the door and stepped aside. The room was dimmer than the hall, lit by a single lamp near the bed and the faint glow of early evening slipping through half-drawn curtains. Machines hummed softly, not intrusively, like insects far away. And there, against white sheets and pillows arranged to hold him upright, was John Wayne. Dean had known intellectually that John was ill. But knowledge is an idea. Seeing is something else. John's frame looked smaller, not only thinner, but somehow more contained, as if his vast presence had folded inward. His face, once cut from stone, now carried softness around the edges. His breathing was slow, deliberate, but when his eyes shifted and found Dean standing in the doorway, something unmistakable stirred behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then John moved his hand, just slightly, a gesture that had once commanded horses and crews alike, now asking for nothing more than recognition. "Well, I'll be," John murmured. His voice was rough, but there was warmth in it. "You actually came." Dean stepped forward. "You asked that I did?" John's mouth twitched. "Didn't know if you would." Dean pulled a chair closer and sat, careful, as though any sudden movement might break something delicate between them. "You think I wouldn't?" John looked at him steadily. "I think men get good at thinking there's always another time." The words settled in the room like dust motes, visible only when the light hit them just right. Dean leaned back slightly, studying his friend's face. The familiar features rearranged by age and illness, but still undeniably John. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though he knew how inadequate the question was. John huffed softly, like a man who's run a long way and finally noticed his legs. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Tired, but not. Not in here." He tapped his chest weakly. Dean nodded. He did not offer false comfort. He did not pretend. He simply said, "I'm here." Something in John's expression softened further at that. They spoke at first of simple things: the drive, the weather, a nurse who had made a joke that morning. John asked about Dean's family, his days, his routines. Dean answered honestly, without embellishment. There was no need for performance here. The room did not require it. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time behaved differently in that space, stretching and compressing according to emotional gravity rather than clocks. At one point, John's eyes drifted to the window. "You remember Monument Valley?" he asked. Dean smiled faintly. "Hard to forget. Used to think," John continued, "that place would outlast all of us. Like it didn't care who stood in front of it. Cowboys, crews, tourists, just kept being what it was." He inhaled slowly. "Funny how we think things that look big must be permanent." Dean followed his gaze. "You were big, John." John's lips curved. "So were you." He paused. "We were also loud, busy, certain." His fingers shifted on the blanket. "We filled rooms so full, there wasn't much space left to hear what mattered." The words were not bitter. They were reflective, as if spoken by someone leafing through a book he had finally learned how to read. Dean leaned forward slightly. "What matters now?" John turned his head back to him. His eyes, though tired, were clear. "That's why I asked you to come." The machines hummed. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Life went on, unobtrusive and relentless. "I've been lying here a long time," John said. "Long enough for the noise to die down. Long enough to hear the things I talked over." He swallowed. "And there's a lot I wish I'd said differently. A lot I wish I'd said at all." Dean felt something tighten in his chest. He did not interrupt. "I spent years being strong," John went on. "Or looking strong. Being the man who didn't flinch, didn't slow down, didn't ask." He glanced at Dean. "Didn't think." Dean shook his head gently. "You don't owe me." John lifted a finger slightly. "I owe myself the truth," he breathed, steadying. "And the truth is, there were times you tried to reach me when I was too busy being an image to be a friend. Times you joked to cover something real, and I laughed instead of listening." Dean's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then returned. "We were both good at that," as John agreed. "We were." He shifted, wincing faintly, then settled again. "But I'm running out of later. And there's something I don't want to carry with me unsaid." Dean waited. John's eyes closed for a moment, as if he were gathering breath, not only for his lungs, but for his courage. When he opened them again, they shone. "People think," he said quietly, "that when a man gets to the end, he thinks about victories, about applause, about what he built." His mouth twitched. "What I think about are the faces I didn't turn toward when I should have." The room seemed to lean in, and you, John continued, were one of the good ones. You saw the joke and the bruise underneath it. You knew when to push and when to sit beside me and say nothing. And I didn't always honor that." Dean's throat tightened. "John, let me finish," John murmured. "Please." Dean nodded. "I asked you here," John said, "because there's a weight I don't want to leave behind. And there's something I want you to carry instead." Dean looked at him steadily. "What's that?" John drew a slow breath. His hand shifted weakly atop the blanket, his fingers curling as though around an invisible rope. "There's something," said his voice lowering, "I haven't told anyone. Something I realized too late to make a show of, but not too late to mean." Dean leaned closer instinctively. As though proximity might help hold the moment together, John's lips parted, and in the quiet room, with the evening light thinning behind the curtains, John Wayne prepared to whisper the words that had been waiting, unspoken. Across a lifetime, the room did not change when John Wayne leaned closer. But everything inside it seemed to draw inward, as if even the air understood that what followed would not be ordinary sound. Dean felt it before he heard it, the subtle tightening of a moment that knows it is about to become memory. John's breathing slowed, his eyes fixing on Dean's with an intensity that did not belong to a man at the end of strength. But to one at the beginning of truth, Dean leaned closer, instinctively lowering his head, not out of courtesy, but out of reverence. There are times when listening is not passive. It is an act of courage. John's lips moved, barely, and in a voice so soft it seemed to rise not from his throat, but from somewhere far deeper. He whispered, "The bravest thing I ever did wasn't standing in front of a camera. It was loving people and never telling them." The words were not dramatic. They were not loud. They carried no theatrical weight. And yet when they landed, Dean felt as if something ancient had cracked open inside his chest. John closed his eyes briefly, as if the sentence itself had taken more strength than he expected. When he opened them again, they glistened. "I built a life around not needing anyone to see me," John murmured. "I let the world think I was made of certainty, of answers, of iron. But the truth is, I spent most of my life terrified of being known." Dean did not speak. He could not have, even if he had tried. He felt suddenly as though he were standing at the edge of a canyon, listening to a voice echo back from his own past. "I was afraid," John continued, "that if I slowed down, If I stopped performing strength, people would see how much I cared, how deeply I felt, and I didn't know how to be a man who carried that openly. Its mouth curved faintly, sadly, so I carried it alone, and I called it dignity. Dean swallowed. The word dignity had followed John Wayne for decades, printed into articles, spoken in interviews, etched into the mythology that had grown around him. Hearing it now, reshaped, felt like watching a statue confess it had always been flesh. I loved people, John said. I loved you. I loved the men I worked beside. I loved the crews, the families, the friends who showed up when the cameras weren't there. But I hid it. I rationed it. I wrapped it in jokes or orders or silence. He exhaled. And now, lying here, that's the thing that weighs the most. Not what I didn't win, not what I lost. What I never let myself give. Dean felt moisture gather in his eyes, not sudden, not explosive, but heavy. Like rain that has traveled a long way before touching ground. You know, Dean said quietly, we all thought you were the strongest man in every room. John's gaze stayed on him. And that, he whispered, is exactly how I managed to avoid being the truest. Silence followed. Not the empty kind. The kind that vibrates with everything it contains. John shifted slightly, as if adjusting himself around the words he had finally released. There were nights, he said, after sets went dark and everyone went home, when I'd sit alone and realize I had everything people chase and almost nothing they lean on. And I told myself that was the cost of the road. The cost of being who I was. His eyes narrowed faintly, not in anger, but in clarity. It wasn't the cost. It was the choice. Dean closed his eyes for a moment. Faces moved behind them, old friends, old rooms, laughter now belonging to another era. He thought of the times he had masked concern with humor, softened pain with performance, buried sincerity under charm. He had always believed himself more open than John. Now he wondered how many doors in his own life had remained politely shut. When you called, John said, I was afraid you wouldn't come. Not because of distance, because of time. Time teaches people to live with what they never repaired. He looked at Dean with quiet urgency. I didn't want this to be another thing I lived with. Dean leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. You don't have to carry it alone, he said. Not now. John nodded faintly. That's why you're here. Another silence. The machines continued their soft, mechanical reassurance. Somewhere far down the hall, a cart rolled. Somewhere outside, the evening finished turning into night. The world was not waiting, but something inside the room was finally moving. You know what I realized? John went on, his voice steadier now, as though confession had cleared a path. The roles people remember most aren't always the ones you played. They're the ones you refused. He looked at Dean. I refused tenderness. I refused to say you mattered to me. I refused to let people carry me the way I carried them. Dean felt a slow, aching recognition spread through him. We thought strength was not needing, John said. But needing is what makes the rest of it real.
Out.
Dean breathed out slowly. Then say it, he told him gently. Say what you didn't. John studied him. For a moment he looked not like an icon, not like a patient, but like a boy deciding whether to step into deep water. I'm proud of you, John said. Not for the stages, not for the applause, for the way you stayed human in a world that pays people to become less so. His voice trembled, just slightly. And I'm grateful you were my friend, even when I didn't know how to be yours properly. Dean's composure finally gave way. A tear slid down his cheek, unremarked, unhidden. You were my friend, he said. You always were. John's eyes closed. A faint sound escaped him, somewhere between breath and relief. Then let me give you something, John whispered. Dean waited. Don't make my mistake, John said. Don't let your life be remembered for what you achieved more than for who you allowed yourself to love. He opened his eyes again. Promise me something. Dean nodded. Anything. Promise me, John said, that you won't save your heart for endings. The sentence landed like a bell. Dean did not answer immediately. He felt its weight. He felt its demand. He felt how easily it could be ignored, how quickly life could pull him back into routines that postponed truth. Then he said, "I promise." John studied his face, as if searching for loopholes. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not the grin of a movie star. It was smaller, realer. It belonged to the man behind the image. They sat like that for a while.
That's
Not speaking, the silence no longer tense, but companionable. At one point, John's breathing grew shallower, and Dean reached out without thinking, resting his hand lightly on John's forearm. The skin was warm, alive, human. "You know," John murmured after some time, "people think death is the moment everything ends." His gaze drifted upward. "I'm starting to think it's the moment you finally stop pretending you have time." Dean nodded slowly. "And start telling the truth," as John said. "Exactly." The door opened quietly. A nurse stepped in, checked a monitor, adjusted a line. She glanced at Dean, then at John, and her expression softened. She did not rush them. She moved as if aware she had stepped into something sacred. After she left, John seemed tired. "But lighter, there's one more thing," he said. Dean leaned closer again. "I don't know how long I have," John said, "but I know this. The fear isn't what's loudest anymore." He looked at Dean. "It's gratitude." "For what?" Dean asked. "For the chance," John replied, "to finally be smaller than my reputation." Dean smiled through the ache in his chest. "You're not smaller," he said. "You're truer." John closed his eyes, a faint nod following, and in the quiet that returned, Dean realized something unsettling and beautiful at once. This visit was no longer about goodbye. It was about inheritance, not of objects, not of stories, but of a responsibility. To live differently, to love sooner, to speak while voices are still strong enough to carry truth. Outside, night had fully settled. The window reflected two men now, one lying down. One seated beside him, no longer legend and entertainer, not icon and companion, but simply two lives intersecting honestly at the edge of a moment neither of them would ever outgrow. And as John's breathing evened, Dean understood that what had been whispered was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of another. Asterisk. The night between what was and what remains, the room had grown darker without either of them noticing. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, almost respectful dimming of light that happens when evening finishes its work and hands the world to night. Only the small lamp beside John's bed still glowed, casting long, gentle shadows across the walls, shadows that looked like the silhouettes of people who had once filled John Wayne's life and were now standing quietly at its edge. Dean noticed the darkness only when he shifted in his chair and realized how long he had been sitting. Without looking at a clock, time had thinned. The visit had slipped free of schedules and become something heavier, something private. John lay still, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. For a moment, Dean wondered if he had drifted into sleep. He watched the rise and fall of John's chest, a faint movement of a man who had once commanded storms of motion with a single step. Dean found himself studying details he had never paid attention to before: the curve of John's cheek, the way the skin at his temples had softened, the faint scar near his jaw that no camera had ever truly captured. These were not the features of a symbol. They were the features of someone's father, someone's friend, someone's once young self. Dean leaned back and closed his own eyes, and in the quiet, memory began to speak. He remembered a set in Arizona decades earlier. The air thick with heat and dust, a day that had begun with tension for no real reason. John had been distant, clipped all efficiency and no warmth. A young crew member had dropped equipment, the crash echoing across the rocks. John had snapped nothing cruel, but sharp enough to leave a bruise. Later that evening, when most had gone, Dean had found the same crew member sitting alone, staring at his hands. Dean had sat beside him, said nothing for a while, then finally told a story so ridiculous the young man had laughed despite himself. When John later asked what they had talked about, Dean had shrugged and said, Nothing that matters. He had not known how wrong he was. The thought unsettled him now. He opened his eyes. John was watching him. "How long was I out?" John asked softly. "Not long," Dean said. "You drifted." John nodded. "I do that more now." His gaze moved to the ceiling. "Funny. I used to hate drifting. It felt like weakness." Turned back to Dean. "Now, it feels like permission." Dean smiled faintly. "Permission for what?" "To stop holding the line," John said. "To stop being on." Dean considered the words. "You were always on," he said. "Even when no one asked you to be." John's mouth curved. "That's the problem with becoming something people recognize. You start to feel like it belongs to them." Paused. "I let the image rent too much space." Quiet settled again. But this one carried anticipation. John inhaled slowly, then spoke, his voice lower, more deliberate. "There's something else," he said. "Something I didn't plan to say tonight. But nights have a way of changing plans." And straightened slightly. "What is it?" John did not answer immediately. His eyes moved to the window, to the faint reflection of the lamp against glass, to the darkness beyond where the world continued without comment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. "I don't want my last days," he said, "to be about me." Dean frowned slightly. "They already are." John shook his head, a small movement. "They don't have to be." He turned back to Dean. "I've had enough rooms built around my name. Enough conversations that circled my work, my past, my myth. I don't want the time that's left to be another monument." Dean waited. "There are people," John continued, "who carried pieces of my life without ever being seen for it. Families who bent around schedules. Friends who stayed quiet so I could be loud. Men who stood in the background while I stood in the light." His eyes held Dean's. "I don't want to leave without turning toward some of them." Dean felt a subtle shift in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," John replied, "I want to do something while I still can. Something small, something real. No press, no performances, just acknowledgement." He breathed. "But I can't do it alone. And I don't trust many people not to turn it into something it isn't." Dean understood before John finished. "You want help," Dean said. John nodded. "I want a witness, not to me." To them, Dean was quiet. The idea carried weight. It implied movement beyond the room. It implied time used not for rest, but for reaching. "What did you have in mind?" Dean asked. John's gaze softened. "There's a man," he said, "who drove trucks on my early pictures. Not famous. Didn't need to be. He lost his son years ago. He wrote me once after it happened. I never answered." His jaw tightened faintly. "I told myself I didn't know what to say. The truth is, I didn't know how to be helpless with him." Dean felt the sting of recognition. "You want to see him?" "Yes." John paused. "And a few others. Not crowds. Just conversations I never finished." Dean exhaled slowly. The doctors, John, lifted a finger. "I'm not talking about tours. I'm talking about moments. And if they have to come here, they can." His eyes sharpened slightly. "But they will come for them. Not for me." The suspense in the room was not about whether John could do this. It was about whether Dean would help him change the shape of his own ending. Dean looked at his friend, really looked at him. Not as a man approaching a final chapter, but as someone trying to write a different one. "I'll help," Dean said. John studied him. "You don't even know what it will cost you." Dean's mouth curved faintly. "I know what it would cost me not to." Something like relief crossed John's face. They spoke then, quietly, deliberately, mapping names and fragments of stories. A sister who had once waited outside a hospital room while John finished a scene. A young actor whose fear he had dismissed too quickly. A woman who had written him letters for years after her husband died, thanking him for the way a certain film had kept her company in a silent house. Names became people. People became responsibilities, with each one. The room felt less like a place of endings and more like a planning room. At one point, John's voice faltered. He closed his eyes, breathing carefully. Dean leaned forward. "We can stop," Dean said. John shook his head. "No. I don't want to stop where I always stopped." The words carried a quiet ferocity, so they continued. Hours seemed to pass, though clocks were not consulted. At some point, the nurse returned, concerned about John's energy. John listened politely, promised to rest, and waited until she left before murmuring, "We'll finish later." Dean smiled. "You're still negotiating." John's eyes glinted faintly. Old habits, eventually exhaustion, did what it must. John's sentences shortened. His eyes closed longer between words. "Dean," he said suddenly, "yes. If I don't get to all of them?" John's voice thinned. "Promise me you'll go anyway." Dean's breath caught. "John, promise me," John insisted softly. "Don't let the ones I avoided believe they were invisible." The request hung in the air. Dean nodded once. "I promise." John's shoulders eased. Then he murmured, "Whatever happens in this body, something good keeps moving." He drifted then, not fully asleep, but somewhere between. Dean stayed where he was, watching the man he had known for decades. Seeing him now not as a presence, but as a passage of place where stories met and then moved on. And in that quiet, Dean realized something that unsettled him more than grief. He was no longer afraid of losing John. He was afraid of failing what John had entrusted to him. Outside, inside, something had been set in motion that would not stop with breath. The night deepened, and between what had been and what remained, a fragile, powerful mission waited. Morning did not arrive with light. It arrived with sound, the distant roll of carts in the hallway, the muted exchange of nurses changing shifts, the subtle chorus of a building that never truly slept, only lowered its voice. Dean lifted his head from the chair where he had dozed, and for a moment did not remember where he was. Then he saw the bed, the lamp, the shape of a man who had once filled rooms and now filled a smaller, quieter space. John was awake. His eyes were open, but they looked different this morning. Not dimmer, deeper, as if night had taken something away and left something else behind. "Did I miss it?" John murmured. Dean leaned forward. "Miss what?" "The morning," John said. "I always liked mornings. Made everything feel negotiable." Dean smiled faintly. "It's here." John nodded once. His gaze moved to the window. A pale, early light pressed gently against the curtains. Not yet strong enough to intrude, only to announce itself. "Good," John said. "Then we didn't wait too long." Dean felt a stir of unease. "For what?" John turned his head slowly. "For action." The word felt heavier than it should have. They did not speak immediately. John's breathing was careful, measured. Dean watched him, sensing that something was different. Not urgent, intentional. After a moment, John spoke. "I had a dream." Dean tilted his head. "About," John considered, "about standing on a set after everyone had gone home. The lights were still on, but no one was there. Just marks on the floor where people had been told to stand." His voice was faint, but steady. "And I realized the marks weren't for them. They were for me. To show me where I had missed people." Dean listened. "When I woke up," John continued, "I wasn't afraid. I was directed." Dean's chest tightened. "Directed to what?" John's eyes met his. "To begin." Within hours, the room changed, not dramatically, not theatrically. But purpose has a way of altering atmosphere. A social worker came. A nurse coordinator. A few quiet phone calls were made. Names from John's carefully spoken list were mentioned. Some people could not come. Some could. Messages were recorded not for public record, but for private delivery. A chair was placed beside the bed that had not been there before. Another after that. The first visitor arrived just after noon. He was older than Dean expected. His back bent from years of work. His hands carried the map of a life that had not been protected by gloves. When he entered, he stopped in the doorway, uncertain, as if afraid he had mistaken the room. "Eddie," John said softly. The man froze. "Mr. Wayne?" John shook his head faintly. John Eddie stepped forward slowly. He looked at Dean, then back at John. I didn't think you'd remember me. I remembered, John said. I just didn't know how to return. Eddie's mouth opened, then closed. He moved closer, awkwardly. They said you wanted to see me. John nodded. I wanted to tell you something I should have said a long time ago. Dean remained where he was, silent, invisible. He watched a life unfold in real time. I got your letter, John said. Eddie's eyes widened. You did? Yes, John replied. I read it more than once. Eddie swallowed. I thought maybe it never reached you. It reached me, John said. I didn't reach back. Silence, my boy, Eddie began, then stopped. His breath caught. I wrote because I didn't know who else would understand what it feels like to lose something and still have to keep going.
Ow.
John's eyes glistened. I didn't answer because I didn't know how to sit with you without trying to fix it. And it didn't need fixing. It needed company. Eddie stared at him. I'm sorry, John said. Not for not having words? For not having the courage to be quiet with you. Eddie's shoulders shook once. Then again, he reached out before he could stop himself, resting his hand lightly on the bed rail. You don't owe me anything. I owe you truth, John said. And thanks. You carried more than equipment. You carried days. You carried people. You carried me. Eddie broke then. Not loudly. Not performatively. But honestly, he nodded over and over as if something long held had finally been set down. Dean looked away, giving them the privacy that mattered more than presence. When Eddie left, his walk was different. The second visitor was a woman who had written John letters for years. She brought one with her, folded thin from handling. She did not expect John to know her name. He did. He thanked her not for admiration, but for endurance. For letting a story keep you company when silence was heavy, he told her. She left her letter on the bedside table. He placed his hand over it as though sealing something. More came, not crowds, lives. And with each one, John grew quieter. But something in the room grew louder, meaning late in the afternoon. After the last visitor had gone, John lay back, exhausted. Dean moved to adjust his pillow. Don't fuss, John murmured. You're allowed to be fussed over, Dean said. John smiled faintly. I'm not used to it. Get used to it. John's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, they were steady. You see, he said, what's happening? Dean nodded. You're repairing. John shook his head gently. No, I'm releasing. Dean frowned. Repair implies control, John said. This is trust. Trust that what was real didn't disappear just because I avoided it. Trust that what I give now still matters, he breathed. Even late. Dean felt the truth of it resonate. As evening approached, John's energy waned. His speech softened. The nurse returned, checked vitals, adjusted medications. She met Dean's eyes in a way that did not need translation. Later, soon, John motioned Dean closer. I'm glad, he whispered. For what? Dean asked. That you didn't let me turn this into a goodbye tour, John said. You helped me make it something else. Dean shook his head. You did that. John's fingers twitched faintly. No, you witnessed it. That's different.
Oh.
Dean leaned in. You changed something today. John's gaze drifted toward the window, now dark again. So did you. For being here, John said. For staying when there was nothing left to be impressed by. Dean smiled sadly. There was plenty. Don looked back at him. And in that look was the man he had always been without knowing how to show it. Promise me, John said softly. You won't let this end here. Won't, Dean replied. John's eyes searched his face one last time. Then he nodded. Then he whispered, whatever happens next is not a closing. He exhaled. The breath did not return. The machines noticed before Dean did. But Dean felt it in the silence that followed, not emptiness. Completion. Nurses moved. Words were spoken. Procedures followed. Dean stood when asked, sat when told. Time behaved again like time. Eventually, the room was still. Dean remained long after he was alone. He looked at the bedside table, the folded letter, the empty chair. The place where voices had been, he did not feel like he had lost someone. He felt like he had been given something. And in the days that followed, he began to do what he had promised. He went 2 people, 2 unfinished conversations, 2 quiet thank yous that had waited. Decades he did not announce them, he did not document them, but everywhere he went, something shifted, not dramatically, humanly. And when people later spoke of John Wayne, they spoke of roles of stature, of the way he once stood like the horizon itself. But there were a few who spoke of something else, of a man who, at the end, chose to turn toward what he had once outrun, of a friend who sent another friend back into the world carrying a different definition of strength, not the strength to endure, but the strength to tell the truth while time still listens,